Thank you for joining the Don't Stop the Education series presented by the Sennheiser Sound Academy. Thank you for joining us for the 6th episode based on podcasting. I'm your host, Tim Moore, and I'm joined by Andy Egerton, as usual, who will be your lead host today, and he will be introducing our guest. I'd like to turn it over to Andy now.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining. I'd just like to mention before we start that we do have the Q&A open. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our guests as we go along, if you could please type them in there, we'll try and get to as many questions as we possibly can. But yeah, over to our guests. So I'll do it as I can see it. So first of all, we have Wil Brown from the UK. We have Alice Williams from the UK. Excuse me. Mark Sharman from the UK, and then we have Henke as well. He's joining us from Stockholm in Sweden. So, sorry, excuse me. First of all, I'd just like to go around the table and ask you to all introduce yourselves. Just take 3 to 4 minutes, give us a little bit of background information about yourselves and the current project that you're currently working on as a podcast. So I'm going to start with Alice, if I may. Oh, you're a bit unmuted there, Alice. There we go.
Hi. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, got you.
Hi. So I began my audio career mainly working in the live situations, so for radio stations, making music shows, arts and culture programmes for the BBC Radio London mainly. And while I was doing that, I really enjoyed the kind of editing process. When we did do pre-recorded interviews, I really enjoyed that kind of crafting of the audio. And then I had the opportunity to work further doing that for BBC Radio 4 on a project they do called the Listening Project, which is a collaboration between the BBC and the British Library, which is a way of recording our lives through conversation. So anybody would come and have a conversation. And that was about 40 minutes, and I had to edit that down to about 3 minutes, and that would be played on national radio. And during that process, I really kind of honed my editing skills, and that fired my sort of passion really for crafted audio. So then I had the opportunity to make some podcasts for The Guardian. So I was working sort of part-time for the BBC and for a national newspaper, The Guardian, making podcasts for them. And making documentaries and things. So I've just sort of gone mainly from doing live radio to more crafted podcast making, and I continue to do that, where I sort of share my time between the BBC and making independent podcasts. I've been working on main one I'm working on at the moment is called Table Manners, which is presented by the singer Jessie Ware and her mum. And they invite a celebrity round to their house and talk about food and family, wherever else the conversation sort of leads really. And we record that at their homes, and they sort of cook the guests a dinner, and they talk to them about food and life.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And I've obviously listened to your podcast. It's fantastic. It's great. And let me shoot over to Mark Sharman, or Sharky, who produces a podcast. Well, I'll let you introduce it.
Hello. So yeah, very similar to Alice. My background was originally in radio. I've been doing radio / audio for about the last 25 years. Started off in commercial radio doing music, moved to the BBC and mainly did live sporting events. Was lucky enough to produce a lot of outside broadcasts like the Olympics, Commonwealth Games, World Athletics, football, golf, most mainstream sports. Left the BBC to go freelance because I wanted to branch out and do some other stuff. So I was lucky enough to do some more pre-built stuff, documentaries for like Radio 2 and Radio 4 over here in the UK, and also managed to do a little bit of telly. Then the sort of podcast revolution started, and we all sort of had to change our mindset a little bit, which I'm sure we'll touch on later, from making radio, and especially live radio, and to producing podcasts. So I've done quite a lot of sports podcasts for various football clubs and sporting bodies, like the European Tour in golf and things like Man United and the Football League and Premier League and stuff like that. But for the last 3 years, as well as still doing other bits and bobs, I produce a program or podcast called Tailenders, which is a cricket, well, this describes as a loosely cricket-based podcast. It started off in cricket, but has spawned into all manner of different subject matters, which I think again is the beauty of podcasts. And that's presented by a trio of Greg James, who presents the Radio 1 Breakfast Show here in the UK, Jimmy Anderson, who's a very successful cricketer, in fact the most successful fast bowler of all time, and a musician called Felix White, who previously used to be in a band called the Maccabees, is now a record label owner, writer and musician in his own right. And over the last 3 years, we've been doing that. We're coming close to our 100th episode, and it's taken us into many different spheres. We now do live shows in front of, in theatres. We have a range of merchandise, etc. And again, that's maybe stuff we might touch on later, but it's certainly gone bigger than I ever anticipated.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And I guess we'll move over to Henke over in Stockholm there. If you could give us a little rundown of your background, please.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm started out as a musician, as a bass player in young years, and been playing in different rock bands all my life, basically. Then I actually moved to Stockholm around 4 years ago, and I moved here because of a job and because of something else. And I quitted that job quite fast, and I had nothing to do. I was in a new city. I didn't know anyone. I didn't know anyone to play music with. And so I hung along with myself and listened to a lot of podcasts and figured out that, hey, I should do this in music, because we didn't really have, or at least I hadn't found anyone that did a decent rock and roll podcast in Sweden. And I mean, Sweden is a huge country when it comes to music, and especially rock and metal, but in all kinds of music. So, and I know that I know a lot about music, so hey, let's start. I didn't really think much of it. I bought 2 cheap microphones and I sent it out the questions to a bunch of rock stars that I feel are like cool and nice people, and say, I'm gonna start a podcast. Do you want to be in it? And pretty much everyone said yes, and from there it just took off. And now I'm in the same situation as Mark, with loads of merchandise and loads of projects tied to my podcast. But yeah, and it's pretty much all my life right now, and I love it. It's the best and most fun project I've ever done.
That's fantastic, and the fact that you left a job you didn't like to go and do something that you love off your own back is fantastic. Thank you so much. That's great. And let's move finally over to Wil Brown, who, if you can give us an introduction, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone. Looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say, actually. So I started off from sort of engineering, sound engineering point of view. I studied music and sound recording. And that course had a placement year where I ended up working in a classical recording company. And so then started out as a freelance classical sort of assistant engineer, editor, and did that for many years. And after, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so, stopped engineering, but carried on editing. So I've always had a sort of a background in editing, although not podcasts or speech. That I've learned on the job doing this. And then in 2006, with some friends, we had a party that turned into a bigger party and ended up turning into a little music festival. And sort of myself and my friend Tim, who I run the Tape Notes podcast with, ended up being the two sort of to really run the festival. And it took over most of our time by the end. We ran it for 10 years and it became a sort of showcase for new bands. And that stopped in 2016, and at the same time we had some video sessions going, much like sort of Mahogany blog or that sort of thing, called the Barn Sessions. And that gave us the idea that actually to spread all this work that we're putting into the festival that only reaches a couple of thousand people, that we're very proud of, we should do more content. And so we applied to the Arts Council and got a grant, and off the back of that had a horrendously overambitious content plan for 3 different podcasts and more video sessions and all sorts of things like that. And long story short of that, out of that, it sort of shook down to being this one this one podcast called Tape Notes, which is a music production podcast hosted by John Kennedy. But yeah, so we've taught ourselves. Yeah, I mean, we can go into the podcast more in a bit.
Fantastic. Well, let's just stick with that, because you mentioned John Kennedy there, who's a radio DJ. How did you approach him, or did he approach you, or how did that come around?
So the festival was started around a friend's band called Laurel Collective, which the drummer in that band is a producer called Charlie Andrew, who's gone on to produce Alt J and people like that. And John was a fan of their band. And so he came down to the festival, and we sort of, I don't know who at the time, twisted arm and asked if he could compare. And so he just became a friend, and every year would be seen running between the stages at the festival, announcing everyone. And when it came to having the idea for this podcast, he just seemed like the perfect person. He's an experienced professional presenter with 20 years of, breaking new acts, and has interviewed everyone under the sun, really. So we asked him, and he was instantly keen. So we were very lucky, basically, that he was there in our little sort of friendship group. Great.
That's amazing. And let me jump to Alice as well, because obviously you're working with Jessie Ware. How did that relationship start, and how did that come around?
Well, she originally, for her first 2 seasons of her podcast, she was using this little production company to make the podcasts, and I was doing some freelance work for them. And then when it got to season 3, there was a bit of a break between the 2 seasons. And I think during the seasons, she thought, actually, I don't really need a production company to do this. I can just kind of run it myself, and with a producer and her manager. So she approached me just to sort of do it independently, directly with her. And so that's how it works now. It's me, her, and her manager really that sort of run it. Her manager does a lot of the sort of dealing with sponsors and booking guests, and then I do all the kind of recording and editing and mixing and uploading, and I sort of help sometimes with guest ideas and contacts, because I've got quite a lot from my years of doing live radio production. But it's just really kind of a tiny little team that put it together.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. And I'm going to extend the same question over to Mark, because obviously did you know the guys before, or was it the BBC that set this up as a kind of idea, or where did the brainchild come from, and where did you then get involved in that?
I got lucky, to be honest. I was approached a long time ago, before podcasts were really a thing, to do a radio show with Jimmy, who was still playing now, but as a cricketer, via his agent. And he just, it was like all the things. He knew somebody who knew somebody who knew me, and we did a radio show. We did for me, Greg, and another cricketer. We did a traditional radio show for several years, and that kind of fizzled out just because everyone got busy. And then the podcast revolution, which I think we've all seen over the last however many years, started again. And I think this was the beauty of why podcasts are successful. And Henke spoke about it sort of briefly, how he would email bands and they wanted to come on it. And I think that's kind of, with all of us, I'm dealing with Greg, who's, here in the UK is a pretty big star. Jimmy's a, international sports person. And, Felix used to perform all around the world with bands. They want to do it. There's something about podcasts, the intimacy, the fact it's a passion project, and they can, it's not live. These people want to do these projects. And I think that's what I found, not just with the projects I work with, but just across the board. You look at any kind of platform, you see the people are doing this, you think, oh, blimey, the X or Y is doing a podcast. And I think it's because they really, really love it. And that love comes over in the podcast as well. So I'd say it was just a bit of who and friends of friends, and they wanted to do it. And it's, they love doing it. And that's the secret. The fact they love it, I think the audience loves it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes across in the podcast as well. With that, Henke, because you was kind of like a self-starter and sort of started from the ground up, what was the first thing that you that drew you to it? It's like, was it maybe you decided upon a structure, or you knew it wanted to be a certain kind of question or anything like that? Or did you just try different things until you kind of found a formula?
Well, if I look back now, yeah, I kind of tried out, but it's pretty much the same. And I I can't really say that I have thought a lot about it. I just make what I think feels good and what I feel passionate about, both coming to what kind of subjects to speak about and what kind of guests I invite. And then my interest has varied from time to time. And I can get really sick of one question or one subject that I always talk about, then I doesn't talk about that in a half a year or something. So I don't know. I don't have any good answer, I guess. I'm very much driven by passion and by my own influence. And I think pretty much it's the same. If you listen to episode 3, you will most certainly recognize it from what it is today. So
a natural evolution. What do you think is the ideal, and from playing around with different podcasts, because one thing that it interests me is like how long should a podcast be? Like, what is the optimum level to keep someone's interest? Or maybe, you know, do you get to a point where it's really good content, so you maybe do a couple of parts, like part 1, part 2, part 3, or something like that? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can start. I personally, I really hate short podcasts. I don't bother to put them on if they're like 22 minutes, even though it can be really great. But myself, I love them like around an hour. And the even better if it's like strict 1 hour, and then it comes, they keep on going for like another 20 minutes, but it's more loose, so it's kind of extra material. And I try to use that myself also, but I would say like an hour or a little bit more than an hour, because then you can do something. You can take that trip or take that bus ride or take that walk without using your phone.
Yeah, great answer. And I guess you've naturally come to by doing your own podcast, you've kind of found that formula. I saw Mark nodding away there. Do you agree? Like about an hour is kind of an ideal length?
Yeah, I think that the point I really picked up was Henke said is, again, I come from a radio background, and radio is quite a personal medium anyway, because you tend to do it, you know, individually. Nobody's, no families sit around radios anymore, communally. So it's quite an individual thing anyway. But podcasts take that to a different level. You know, when somebody's listening to your podcast, they're totally engaged. They're not, you know, I have the radio on all the time and do lots of stuff, and half it goes in, half it goes out. But when it's a podcast, I think people are really, really engaged. And therefore, you need to, for me, I'm thinking, what am I doing when I listen to podcasts? I'm probably walking, I'm probably commuting, I'm probably doing something where there's nothing else, you know, I don't have to talk to anybody else. And those activities tend to be, you know, an hour or under. You know, for me, it's sort of 45, 50 minutes, unless it's a special, as a real reason to go belong, because, you know, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and that's what I do. I'll go for a walk, I'll go for a run, I'll go for, well, not so much running, if I'm honest, you know, and that's how I, you know, engage with them, and that's how much I want to listen to them. And that's my kind of rule of thumb, you know, an hour or just under.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm just going to remind anyone watching, we do have the question panel open, so please get your questions in and we'll make sure that we ask them all. But on that one, Alice, I'm going to jump to you. So do you agree, do you kind of have a structure to make them an hour or a certain length of time? And if so, do you have do you pre-plan a structure of how you would like the podcast to go? Because yours are kind of, it feels like, when Jesse's sat in the room, the conversation just naturally flows. Is there something in the background of any kind of structure there, or do you just naturally let it go?
A structure in that, I'm not muted, am I? No. We have a structure in that we do always have like an intro, then we have the main part of the interview and the guest is there, and then we have an outro, and we try and make the sort of intro a bit more in that we record that in the sitting room, so it's sort of better sound, and the outro, and move into the kitchen when it's the main interview. And in terms of length, I aim for about 45 minutes, try not to go too much over an hour. I think in a way it depends on the format, the story you're telling, it depends on the sort of subject of the story. There is a place for podcasts in maybe news ones, I would listen to 20 minutes of daily podcast. I don't know if it needs to be much longer than that. But I think a podcast really needs to be sort of as long as it needs to be, as short as it can be. So kind of as long as it needs kind of any whatever format really. I think that kind of is a rule of thumb I go by. And in terms of the format with Table Manners, it's quite in a way a challenge in that I record a whole evening and I have to condense a whole evening of them having dinner and drinking wine and moving around the kitchen into an hour. And it has to sort of follow the narrative really of the evening, so that you have to hear them having the main and then having the dessert, and you kind of you have to be able to follow it. It has to be linear. So sometimes I have to be a bit ruthless, but often you just don't want to hear people eating, so I cut all that out anyway. So it's the main chat is before they've started eating, and then once they sort of get into the cutlery clatter and the masticulating, that kind of I cut all that out anyway.
I know we've spoken about that before, actually. So how long do you like, as an estimate, once you've got all that raw footage audio there, how long does it roughly take you to edit that down to an hour's podcast?
So normally my recordings are often between 2 and 3 hours long, and that can take me, I'm lucky if I can get it done in a day. Normally takes me 2 days, because once you've edited it down, fiddled around with the intro, making that bit sound kind of really, kind of slick, and then listened to that, then made any changes, double checked it again, it probably takes a day and a half, can take 2 days. Editing takes ages, as you'll probably all agree with me. It takes absolutely ages.
I'm going to go to Wil next and ask the same. So do you work with a kind of structure that's pre-planned or a certain thing? And again, for the editing, I guess from your background with audio, you do all the editing yourself as well. And how long does that take?
I do. I mean, I've got a couple of younger guys sort of helping me now, who I'm sort of, working with, and we're trying to sort of still very much in the process of trying to work out what the best flow is, what it makes sense for me to do, what I can hand over, all that sort of thing. Yes, we do have a format. I mean, ours is based around, we'll discuss 3 tracks, usually from one album, to sort of tell the story of how an artist writes an album, and we'll have the producer involved as well in that chat, and hear playback of, the earliest possible demos they'll let us get our hands on, and, up to the sort of finished master. In terms of how long it takes, I mean, we record for 2.25 hours is normal, over 3 hours on a really long one, and that'll take me probably more like 3 days to edit, because it takes the best part of a day just to sort out all the musical bits, making that slick. So I'll always ask, if we're in person, I'll be obviously recording everything separately, but even if we're remote, I'll be asking the guests to record it their end, so I have the best quality and the scope to then play with it afterwards. It does. The editing does just take such a long time. And to be honest, I often don't get as many passes as I would like, because it's not until you've done a certain edit and then step away from it and actually listen to it going for a walk. I mean, the difference between listening to your edit going for a walk and when you're sat in front of your computer is just annoyingly big. And sometimes I don't get a chance to go for that extra walk that I would like to, where I think actually, right, I'll really get a chance to hear the flow of the story of, that this particular podcast, this episode is telling. And then maybe, in a way you need to listen in a big flow to cut out the big chunks. And when you're chunking in a small way, that's when you're DMing and R'ing and all that sort of stuff, trying to make people as eloquent as possible. It's something we're constantly talking about. How, I mean, our show is significantly longer than an hour, an hour and a half normally, I would say, but can be up to 2 hours. And we're constantly sort of looking at, is that too long? Can we make it shorter? But at the same time, my sort of rule of thumb is it interesting? Am I getting bored at any point? There's a lot people can say. And so we just allow the format. One of the beauties of podcasts is that you can go in depth in a way that radio potentially couldn't, because you've got an audience who are there for your niche. You haven't forced them. So, so we sort of go with it and just try and keep it interesting, basically.
Fantastic. And I was listening to the Mystery Jets podcast I think that was maybe the latest one out that you did, and that was recorded over 5 months because you did the first bit and then you had to go back and complete it 5 months later. How did you tape the mics? It's like it has to be this distance away, and did you try and sit everyone in the same place, or how did you approach that?
Yeah, as much as I could. I did at the time, I did take a load of settings. I didn't end up using them, but I was using the same mics in the same room with people sat in roughly the same place. So I can't actually remember how much of a struggle that was mix wise, but I think it was, it wasn't too bad.
I wouldn't have noticed that it was over unless they'd have said it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was great. I'm going to jump to Henke because we have a technical question coming in from Khan here. He's in lockdown and he's trying to do some recording, but he's only got an iPhone, so he's got very minimal equipment. So I guess the question is, how can you approach a podcast with minimal equipment, or how do you start off with like a starter package and maybe build up as you go and educate yourself in those areas?
Well, I bought 2 real cheap microphones, like 30 euros each, and they're actually great. I still use them from time to time. And I had this, what do you call it in English? Like, it's an audio box. Is that the sound card?
Audio interface, sound card.
Yeah, audio interface, of course.
Yeah.
A cheap one, like 100 euros, and I had my old laptop. So that's what I had from the beginning. I guess you can do it on iPhone if you have at least a couple of headphones with mic. And well, I still use the freeware called Audacity for editing. I think that's brilliant, actually. And it's real easy to start with if you're not that super into different music programs and sequencers and stuff. So, I mean, it can be real easy to do it.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Real cheap. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess you just build up as you go along, better microphone, better interface.
Yeah.
That kind of.
And I mean, still is of course you need great equipment, but you need to know where to put the microphone. That's the number one rule. You can buy the world's most expensive microphone, but if you can't place it in the proper place, you will have bad sound anywhere. So anyway, learn your equipment. I think that's the rule number one. Then you can start building better and better equipment.
That's some great advice. And let me jump to Mark. Is it different? So obviously yours is a BBC podcast. Do you edit the podcast yourself, or is that done? Do you kind of look after the recording, then someone else does that section? Or are you involved in that?
So pre-pandemic, we'd use BBC's facilities, so BBC Studios, and we'd get as many people in there as possible. Jimmy, as an international sports person, was often around the world, and we've recorded him, as say, in various places, and we have actually given him a microphone, and sadly sometimes he does use it very well, and sometimes he doesn't use it so well, picking up on Henke's point. So yeah, we would normally record in a BBC studio, and again we would record for an hour and a half, hour 45, and try and get it down, and I would edit it. So I bring it back and edit it basically at home, to be quite frank, because I don't like hanging around to the BBC studios. Come back, edit here, and then fortunately I'm lucky I can then just deliver the audio to them, and they will distribute it on the various platforms. I don't have to worry about the upload, and they will also share it on social media and do a lot of promo for me. So I have to say, probably compared to others on this panel, I've got a lot of other people who help me, do some of the legwork in terms of upload and promo and social media and all that sort of stuff. So in some ways I do have it a bit easier.
That's great, and I guess that gives us this next question then, is because something I've always wondered: if I produce the podcast, I've mixed it, mastered it, whatever, how do I then get it out into the world? So I'm going to ask Alice that question, if I may.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it really is about sort of plugging away, getting as many people as you can to listen to it. So social media. I think that's the main thing, is social media, really. Mailing lists. Another really good way is cross promotion. So if you can get on to other people's podcasts to your podcast, then you're kind of tapping into that that community of podcast lists, and then other kind of traditional sort of marketing ways, really, getting on radio shows or, you know, in magazines or on newspapers, social media, and inviting guests on that have a big following and asking them to tweet about it or Instagram about it. That is, I think, a real key one. Henke is getting the thumbs up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, we were lucky enough that we had O'Brien from Radiohead on the other week. I mean, yeah, it's a gift.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually that's what we kind of did with Jessie to begin with, invited her sort of most famous friends on. So she's like super well connected. So we had Ed Sheeran, Sam Smith. So if you sort of, you know, get high profile guests on and ask them to tweet about it, then you're laughing.
Yeah, for us it was the 1975 effect. They just sort of, that particular episode for us, their fan base were just so engaged. It was amazing. Just
It's a great band.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed the episode.
So
I also have to say, I mean, to make a great content is really important, because pretty much everyone I know, they want to discover a new podcast, they want to discover a new great TV show on Netflix or whatever, and people ask each other all the time. And I mean, if you're doing a great podcast, it will kind of involve or grow bigger by itself, because people will tell their friends. But I mean, that's really hard, but as long as you're doing something really good, I think it will spread.
Yeah, and the one thing I've learned, sorry, go on, Alice.
No, I was just going to say word of mouth, definitely, that really works with podcasting. Have you heard that podcast? Definitely, that's a big one.
So I don't know if you can still hear me.
Mark,
but I was also going to say that, again, because I come from a radio background into podcasts, what I quickly learned and sort of blew my mind to the extent was, you know, obviously this is global. You know, I was used to broadcasting either in local radio, which is a very small part of the UK, or the BBC, which is obviously Britain. And then all of a sudden you have the whole world. And even though you might be doing something which is niche, which much as I love to think that cricket is the greatest game in the world, I appreciate there's vast swathes of the country. Look at Henke, who probably got no interest in cricket.
No, we don't know how it works.
No, you don't know how it works.
No.
But the brilliant thing is about podcasts, whether it's, you know, rock music and heavy metal, which I love, you know, that's my genre of choice, or whether it's food, or whether it's, you know, music, these things go all around the world. So all of a sudden, even though you're doing something which you think is quite niche, you know, for my case, we've got, you know, all the big cricket countries, India, Australia, you know, New Zealand, South Africa, etc., etc., and that just literally opens up a whole new world which we didn't have in old school radio, and that's been brilliant as well.
Fantastic. So I guess.
Sorry, Andy, I was going to say, I think the niche podcasts do really well, because then you're tapping into a community. So like there's huge like quilting podcasts in America and like cycling ones. And like if you're going for that subject, they do really well, because you are tapping into a community that's already really fanatic about something.
So a question then for Henke, and I guess as little crossover to Wil as well, because Alice just touched on that there, where obviously Jessie's well connected, and that then opens up the doors to get on different guests. I guess, Henke, for you, is that more, do you just sort of email out or tweet or direct message the artist, or do you know some festival promoters that you can maybe pull in, or music venues? How do you get the guests onto your show?
You mean like now?
Yeah.
Well, now it's kind of managed itself. I get emails every day from people that want to be on the show. A lot of small bands, a lot of upcoming bands, but pre-pandemic, I had at least one email a day from different record labels or promoters and stuff. So I'm learning more now how to say no than to say yes, because that's the main part of it. And I also always want to have my own guests, so to say, that I have chosen and that I have really laid down a lot of work and effort to get a hold of and to get that special interview with. So, But the ones I reach out to, I direct message them, either Facebook or Instagram, and I try to tell them why I want to meet them and why I like them. That usually works.
Fantastic. Yeah, because I guess it shows a vested interest that you're a fan or that you appreciate their work rather than just sort of pinging people to kind of get them on. That's a great piece of advice. How about you, Wil? How do you pull or choose or select which bands you want to get in?
So, I mean, this is the side that Tim deals with. And I guess we started off in our sort of circle of people we knew at the very beginning. And then it grows from sort of, you get bolder and, you know, the sort of profile of your guests encourages other people to come on. And so, yeah, then now it's a combination of cold calling or cold emailing. Being approached now, we are regularly approached by labels and managers themselves. Yeah, so it's sort of, I guess it's getting more and more now we're being approached, and it's we'll sit down and sort of have a game plan for who we'd ideally like to get on, and that'll be 5 times as many people sort of end up coming on. And you're also looking at who's you know, album cycles, promo cycles. So who's got something, you know, who's got a reason to be chatting about their music, sort of thing. Or what's fun actually is going back and looking at albums that are 10 years old or 20 years old. A really enjoyable one a while ago for Tim and I was doing the 20th anniversary of Nitin Sawhney's Beyond Skin album, you know, which we both loved as sort of 19, 20-year-olds. And then to be sat in a room with him 20 years later was not something we ever sort of imagined we'd be doing. And he was amazing. I mean, I think one of the things that really comes across is people are always more amazing in real life than you even expect. So yeah, it's fun.
Fantastic. And I guess so, as apart from Henke, I guess as the other three are you three are sort of more producer type, that there's more people involved, whereas Henke's kind of like doing everything himself. How much influence do you have on maybe the interviewer? So with Alice, if Jess is asking a question, are you able to kind of make eye contact and direct it in a certain way, or do you just let it go? The same with Mark. Do you have to rein things back or push them in a certain direction, or once everything's up and going, do you just kind of let it naturally be?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to do that as much as possible. It's very different from when you're doing live radio, because when you're obviously doing live radio, you talk back screen where you can type up to your presenter, like, shut up, it's boring, or like in their ear, you can be like, okay, move on. And when you're recording in Jess's kitchen, you can't really do that. So sometimes I might write things down and just let her know. But that's quite rare because it kind of is just really distracting for her. So what normally happens is I just run. That's why we end up recording 3 hours. And then if there's things at the end that I feel like, you know, she's maybe forgotten, or if something had cut off, then what happens is Lenny or Jessie might ask a question and then the microwave will go off, or the food needs getting out, and that'll totally cut the flow of what the guest is answering. So I'll just say, oh, could you just go back to what you were talking about earlier? So, because I know in my edit, otherwise it's going to be a total nightmare. And then so I'll just do some pickups at the end rather than trying to interject too much in the flow of the conversation. I mean, I do sometimes if I'll say, oh, you know, if they do get up to go and get the microwave, I was like, oh, you were just talking about, you know, that time when, and so they can pick that up. So yeah, it's a bit of both, really.
Fantastic. And Sharky, what about yourself?
Well, say pre-pandemic, we would tend to record in the BBC studio. So I would have talkback direct to Greg, the presenter. You know, he's one of 3 presenters, but he is the main lead. And I'd only have talkback to him. The other guys I just let go. And I do let him go, you know, run free quite a lot. But, you know, I suppose it's because I am old school, so to speak. I probably can't resist, you know, talking his ear saying, move on, this is boring, or ask this, ask that. I'm also very aware that he, you know, because I've worked with him so long, you know, he is a good decade or more younger than me. So I'm also conscious that if we have a guest or there's points of relevance, which I think he won't know of because they are old, you know, I can say, oh, you know, played for blah, blah, blah in 1985, 86, or whatever. But just, I would tend to let everything flow within reason. We do have quite a lot of, I don't know if the other guys have this, but I've got 3, sometimes 4 presenters, and how should we put it? There's quite a lot of dicking about, to be quite frank. So there's quite a lot of that which I have to, manage to an extent. You don't want to lose the flow, but at some point you have to say, come on guys, we have to actually make something here which is listenable. So I'll try to manage that. And then a bit like Alice was saying, pickups are so important. You don't want to interrupt, but you also, in your head, you're listening to the edit. Or at least I am. When we're recording, I'm thinking, what's the edit? So I'm thinking, well, we need to get from that to that, and we haven't got that. So either as a group or Greg on his own, I'll say, right, we just need to do that again or that, because I know once I get back to edit and haven't got it, I'm going to be tearing what little hair I've got left out. So yeah, I probably interrupt a little bit more than other people, but old habits, I'm afraid.
Well, that's it. I guess that's the role of a producer. How do you find it, Will? Because John's very, you can tell he's been doing it a long time, interviewing.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm probably the opposite, in because I'm teaching myself on the job. I'm trying to encourage myself to interrupt a bit more. But of course, you are trying to let them flow as much as you can. And I feel very sort of self-conscious and don't want to be, annoying John or disturbing him in the middle of his thought process. So it's trying to find that balance. I think originally I probably wasn't cutting in enough. Very much, as Sharky said, having the edit in your mind as you're thinking of it, or as Alice was saying, making sure that you've got all the sort of leads. And I'm getting better at that basically as I do more of it. And always trying to develop the system. Like I've spent hours, trying to research little like teleprompting apps, although none of them quite do what I want. And actually, lockdown has just got me doing it live over a Google Doc to John. I would be handing him bits of paper in the room normally. But actually, I think that's probably the system we'll stick with. It works well. It's about, you want him to notice it, but not be too intrusive. And like when we did a live show, actually, I just remember being very self-conscious about, we did a live show at Moloko with an audience of 200 or so. And I, talking to his headphones, I didn't want to make him suddenly jump in front of the audience, but he is a pro. He didn't, he never showed. But I was very scared of ever sort of saying too much down the talk back then.
Yeah. Just in regards to talking to them, and again, I might be in a different position because mine is a BBC podcast, and it's a national broadcaster, state funded, etc. And I don't know if the other guys have to worry about this, but I'm also conscious of adhering to, I have rules I have to adhere to. I have editorial standards, which, we all have editorial standards, and we all have the law of the land when it comes to libel, etc. But I am also mindful that, again, unlike probably the other 3 people in this panel, I have to send my podcast off to be listened to somebody at the BBC before it's put to air, so to speak. It's complied. Somebody listens to it to make sure it is fit to broadcast and compliant to the BBC standards. So again, I'm very wary of taste and decency and all those things, which I'm not saying these guys don't have podcasts which adhere to that, but that's just another thing I have to think about when perhaps other podcasts I've done where it's a bit more whatever, we'll stick it out, no one's gonna be offended, let's get on with it.
It's interesting you say that, actually. When I first started doing podcasts, especially Jesse's one, I had to take my BBC hat off because I was like cutting things out that I would be just cutting out because I been working for the BBC for years. So I'd cut out reference to somebody smashing somebody's face in or swearing, of course. And then I was like, I had to get used to, it's like, okay, it's fine. It's a podcast. It's like, I'm not going to get in trouble for this. You don't have to worry.
Yeah. And I would say the flip side, and I've mellowed a bit, but in the early days, I was probably over conservative. I mean, like we now have, one of our guys, Felix, he is a musician. And he'd started bringing his guitar in, and we would be like having what I thought was serious, in-depth conversation. He'd just start playing flamenco, over it, and I'd be like, I want to listen to this. What the heck? This is not radio. And then it took me a while to think, I know it's not radio. You get into that, and similarly, the guys themselves, they don't swear a lot, and obviously I have to bleep it out because it's a BBC product, but they had to change their mindset again. And if I'm honest, I'm probably not gone as much across and dropped my BBC hat as much as I should, really.
And I think it's those things that make your podcast so popular, probably. It's like making it more human and sort of personable, having the flamenco suddenly coming out of nowhere, or like when, you know, quite early on, we had the problem with Jessie's fire alarm. It would go off all the time, anytime she burnt anything slightly or a bit of steam. And then my sort of first reaction would be like, oh, I need to cut that fire alarm out. Actually leaving it in and hearing them all freaking out was really funny, and that kind of builds an audience, because then it's more human, more personable, and that's the beauty of the podcast format, really.
Definitely.
Is leaving kind of making it more relaxed like that.
People like to see behind the curtain, and again, as I develop, I'm leaving much more stuff in. I'll always double check with the guys, because sometimes, you know, we all say things on the microphone which perhaps you know, you don't want to be broadcast. Nothing too bad, but you know, I'll always say, guys, you know, I'm going to leave that in. Are you happy with that? And it, you know, made me make a mistake, or you said it's a fire alarm going off, or, you know, whatever. Well, you know, we had a thing where Jimmy was in his home office and his shredder started going off, and that has now become a story. You know, I've had it, the greatest fast test bowler in history, on a stage in front of 1,900 people shredding stuff. You know, it's just mad. That, you know. That's the level of our content, I'm afraid. But that would never have got anywhere near a BBC or an old school radio programme. That would have come straight out.
Yeah. And like you said, that is a major feature now. Which,
yeah, sadly.
I was found hilarious. But I guess, Henke, you don't have any of these issues. You have complete control. You can say what you want. I've listened to quite a lot of your podcasts, and it's very free flowing. And I think what I took from your podcast, you just let them just naturally go.
Yeah, I kind of want them to naturally go. I don't like people talking bad about others, unless they're like really big bands. I can manage with that, but otherwise I want to keep a nice tone. But I have nothing against like people swearing or people saying all kinds of shit. I don't care at all. I love it. I want people to confront, but I don't want it to people to push down others. That's my kind of only rule. But I'm not that hard with that either, because if you say something stupid, you have to stand up for that's your problem, I guess. And I don't have to stand for everything that all my guests are saying. So, hey, the freedom of speech.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
I just want to roll it back a little bit, because we when we were talking about production and how we edit and those kind of things, we've had a couple of questions in, and there's a lot of people, and I'm going to direct this to you, Henke, if you don't mind. But what tips have you got when it comes to publishing your podcast to various platforms? So getting it on Apple, getting it on iTunes, I think there's another one, Podbean, that they've mentioned here.
Yeah.
And your own website. What is the process of getting the podcast up?
That was something I was hard on from the beginning. I said it has to be everywhere, not like, oh, you have to go to this sound cloud thing to listen to it. Is the podcast got to be everywhere. So I took a couple of days on those old days. I mean, 4 years, a lot of time in this podcast world. So I had to like email them to get submitted to all the different platforms. But now it's kind of by itself automatically. I use Podbean, by the way, and from there to Spotify is really easy. Spotify is huge in Sweden on podcast. I don't know how it is in UK. And iTunes, obviously, and all of the different platforms. So I use Podbean, and from there you get the service to reach out to every major platform at least.
Okay, fantastic. That's cool. How do you approach that, Wil? Because I know, is that something you deal with, or your partners deal with?
Tim deals with it really, but I mean, very similar to Henke. We started on Libsyn, and then because we wanted to have some dynamic sort of, pre-roll stuff, then we went to Podbean basically, and we're still at Podbean at the moment.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm unmuted. Sorry, and we've got another question coming in there from Yash, who's interested in starting his own podcast, doing everything himself, a bit like what Henke is doing. But he's wondering, how do you monetize a podcast, or how can you create some revenue or a sponsor or something like that?
I get that question a lot. A lot of people emailing me asking, how do I get money? I have this great idea. And I think I used to answer, like, if you want to get in this to make money, you shouldn't go into it. It's kind of the same as start a rock band. I mean, if you start a rock band to become rich, don't start a rock band. And obviously you can make money from podcasting, but you have to have the real passion to do at least 40 or 50 episodes without making 1 cent. That's my total belief. And if you're not prepared to do that, don't start a podcast. There's a lot of easier way to make money.
Absolutely. And what about Wil? How do you do it?
So we've been very lucky with a partnership with Focusrite, who we just sort of got chatting to through colleagues who work there, and they wanted to be doing more to inspire their audience, and we share a very similar demographic. You know, we're inspiring musicians and producers and people looking to make music, people interested, and that's who, you know, they're making interfaces for. And so, yeah, for the last 9 months or so, we've had a partnership with Focusrite. Well, I also reached out to Sennheiser Neumann and have had some support with equipment there. So, and then long term, I think, you know, we're looking at advertising and that sort of thing. But again, you know, if you want to keep the quality there, then you've got to make sure it's relevant and not cheapening the show if you are going to do it. And as Henke said, like, first of all, you've got to make sure you've got a good show and an audience, and that only comes from a place of a lot of hard work and passion, and, you know, work, you know, until you get to that point, and then you can start to worry about. I mean, obviously, you know, it is important, because if you want the show to last long term, you know, Tim and I pretty much work on it full time, and at some point to keep that going, you know, you've got to have the right amount of money coming in. So it's very important, but you don't start there.
Yeah, I didn't mean to be rude to the guy who asked the question, but I just mean that don't start with that focus, and it will eventually solve itself. For me, it took pretty much on the day 1 year from the first episode to I had a great company calling me up, said, hey, we have the same demographic, we need you, what does it cost? And I could tell them pretty much, I could set the price myself, and I was like super fortunate. So 1 year at least for me.
And I guess it goes back to the original point you made about great content. It's all about the content that cuts through, isn't it? And gets you to that position. I know, Alice, that your podcast, there's a sponsorship element involved in that, isn't it? Because I've noticed that the sponsorship changes. So is that through like an agency or something?
Yeah, so I would back up totally what everybody's been saying. It would have taken, you know, Jessie funded the podcast herself, paid for the producer and the food and everything and the equipment, and I think it probably a year to start seeing any return on that. So yeah, and you have to, you know, be in it because you really want to be in it, and not because you want to make a quick buck. But in terms of now, so we are with Acast. We upload our podcast to Acast, who then sort out the sponsorship. They strike the deals with the advertisers. Henke, you got something to say?
They're located in Stockholm. Acast.
Yes.
It's a Stockholm company.
Yes. Yeah, they're totally smashed it in terms of, you know, sort of cornering that market of injecting sort of dynamic ads, so that they will have ads that change from the pre-roll, the first ad, the middle one, and the end one. And the way that it works is that they will come on board for a certain amount of time, pay a certain amount of money to be on that podcast for 2 weeks, or however long it gets to however long it takes to have had a certain amount of listens, and then the advert will change. That's the way it works for Acast at the moment. I think it's changed. I don't think it was like that to begin with. I think to begin with it will stay on there for as long as it takes to get to a certain amount of listeners. I think it's changed slightly, but that's how it works now. Yeah.
Which is something you can do yourself nowadays, if because we very much looked down that route and decided that sort of it was probably worth our while to sort of go it alone. And I think we were lucky, but there is, as I mentioned, through Podbean and services like that, the chance to do dynamic advertising yourself if you want to put in the effort, basically, and it's worth your while.
So with that, does that mean that you have to change the ad yourself then?
Yeah, we would just have to. There's just a section you create a campaign basically, and you would upload ad file. Yeah. We're just using it for dynamic pre-rolls each week at the moment, but there's the option to stick in a mid-roll or a post-roll, and I think you just set a time you want it to appear, or it'll have I haven't done a mid-roll yet, so I don't know technically exactly how it works, but it's possible basically.
Okay.
Fantastic.
I feel very bad because the great British public pay for my podcast, so apologies.
You're welcome. It's interesting though, Sharky, because you mentioned that, but your podcast has become a live show. So I know that I think Wil, you've done a similar thing as well. So how did it become that obviously going from a podcast, you decided to do a live event and go down that side of things?
Well, I think twofold. A, because lots of people were doing it again here in the UK. Podcasts moving into the live space has happened certainly the last sort of 5-6 years. Again, quite a lot of the BBC podcasts, a lot of their comedy, but also independent as well. I work in sport a lot, so I know a lot of sports podcasts who have gone into the live sphere, and obviously again maybe a bit UK focused. But my dad wrote a blah blah blah. That's done a world tour, etc. To be honest, ours was just let's just try it. A bit like setting up the podcast in the first place. Let's try it. We don't really know, are people going to pay to come and watch it, to be quite frank, and what is it? Because we were very conscious that we didn't want if people were going to pay their hard-earned cash, not just to come and see, 3 blokes sat around a table talking cricket for an hour. So we wanted to give them something extra. So we just tried it, and it went beyond our wildest dreams. We've played some relatively large theatres here in the UK. Pre-lockdown, we had plans to do some more, and hopefully, I'm not sure exactly when, but hopefully at some point in the not too distant future, we'll be able to do it again. But it's great because it's another revenue stream, and even though, and I won't get into the politics of the BBC, even though I am a state-funded podcast, there is ways and means for the BBC to be revenue generating. But it's great. You get to meet the audience. You get to try new things out. You get to do something. You get to do a show. You get to do a show in front of people. And I'm a frustrated musician. Never got to play a decent venue. So to play in front of 1,900 people, albeit I'm actually in the sidelines and very rarely put my head literally around the curtain. But it's great, and I love it. I won't lie. I absolutely love it, and it's fantastic to see and meet the audience.
Fantastic. And Wil?
Yeah, similarly, it was a way to bring the brand alive and, actually get people engaged. Well, give something more back to the audience. And we started out with a show at Latitude, which ended up being an interesting one because the guest turned up halfway through the interview because he got lost on site. It ended up being this momentous sort of, he's a great character. It's Murray, the lead singer from a band called Easy Life. And halfway through the show to blaring music, he came running down the hill and in, and on the interview carried. And then we've done one other live at Moloko Studios. We took a room there and did the whole thing on wireless headsets in partnership with Sennheiser, actually. And that was amazing because everyone is then, that's an idea we got from the festival, where we used to run our poetry and spoken word area on silent disco headsets because we were really anti-sound spill, and it was just a way that everyone got really locked into what was happening. And so it was always a sort of dream to do that with the podcast, and we managed. And then we had a sort of busy summer, we hoped, coming up, doing the whole, many more festivals, but of course that's not the year that is ahead of us anymore. So we'll see what happens in that regards, but certainly keen to get out there doing as many live ones as it can. I mean, the Moloko show we did ended up being a full 2-hour show, and people were glued. They loved it. So
I think one thing I've learned from the live shows, which comes back to where we started, which is passion and community and things like that. We've probably all been to, oh, should we go to cinema? Oh yeah, we'll just go to cinema, fill an evening, or might go and watch this or watch that. The people who come really, really, really want to be there, and they're really super invested in there. And as the person who makes it, that's brilliant to be able to see that, not just because, let's be frank, it's a nice ego trip, but it helps you inform the show and what you do, because they are super invested in it. And you think, well, if they are, that passion rubs off on you, and it's a symbiotic relationship without sounding too arty, farty, whatever. But it's definitely brings home to you that even though, say, we do something which is relatively niche-ish in the sporting world of cricket, the people who buy into it really buy into it.
It's so as well, because we started Latitude. We did our first live show at Latitude, and then we did 3 dates at Edinburgh Festival last summer, and we were about to do a UK tour of Table Manners, but obviously that's been cancelled. But what I think is so nice, because editing and making a podcast is actually quite a lonely little experience. Like, just at home in the headset listening away, and then suddenly you're in a live show and full of the audience, and it's just really nice to make it a kind of a bit more of a sociable experience and meet people that are really into it and what you do, and makes it kind of worth the hours and hours and editing out the ums and ahs.
Lots of ums and ahs. I didn't initially, but then after a while, you just sort of couldn't help myself. And I think it's worth it. It is worth it in the long run. But
so we've touched on it a little bit there. Then we've talked about the pandemic. So I think we'd be remiss not to address that. So there's a question as well coming here from Dennis, and he's asking, the pandemic has launched 1 million new podcasts. So what will the future of podcasting look like, and what trends do you see, or what can you see happening? So I'm going to jump to Henke, if I may.
I listen to heavy metal. We don't see fashion or trends. We're pretty much the same as 1980. And I have no idea about trends in podcast. I hope every day that I will find a podcast that I never would have come up with myself. So, like in everything else, I love new podcasts. I love new music and new TV shows, but I haven't. If I had the idea, I would have done it. So I have no idea. But I guess true crime have to slow out someday. There can't be that many interesting crimes now left to do.
The thing that ironically strikes me, I mean, this is a complete guess, is just in a way podcast is going to have to go back into being in stations that are a bit more curated, because there's so much choice out there, and people are going to start to need their podcast podcasts will be, I think, as is happening a bit already, but sort of grouping together and forming streams that are curated, so to take away some of the overwhelm. I don't know. That's a sort of guess, because there is so much choice out there now.
I think in terms of the pandemic and the way we've changed our way we're working and recording remotely, I really hope that it doesn't mean that everybody's just going to carry on recording remotely, because it does end up being a different interview. I mean, especially with Table Manners, they don't get dinner, and but even without the sort of cooking and food element, I think you do get a different kind of recording and interview if you're not sat there opposite somebody, really. But it doesn't mean that you can get guests that you wouldn't have necessarily got before. We did John Legend last week from America. I doubt that John Legend would have come all the way to Clapham to have dinner with Lenny and Jesse. I mean, maybe, but it does mean you get different guests. But I hope it doesn't mean that people will just get a bit lazy. Oh, just remotely now, because I think it does such an intimate interview.
I think the good podcasts will rise to the top, post-pandemic. That word of mouth, that next true crime thing. Sorry, Henke. That it will they will continue to be successful. I think another trend, I think a lot of big players have realized the value of podcasts. Those that didn't necessarily see the true value, some big-ish broadcasters, I can only really speak from a UK-centric perspective, have started commissioning more, and there's various funds being provided to provide more podcasts. So I think that's an interesting development. I think also, again, I don't necessarily say it's a trend, but the sense of community, and apologies for banging on about this, but again, I can only relate to my podcast and the interaction I get with my audience. The podcast has been appreciated more than ever. I was slightly worried about whether we should carry on during the pandemic, because we are a sports podcast and there is no sport going on. And a lot of our USP is, the inside track. We have a current sportsman on the podcast and he tells us things that, other people don't. And that was a big sell. We don't have that. So I actually had a conversation the other week with a few people saying, should we be doing it? Should we have a pause? Should we come back? And actually we decided that people are appreciating so much that sense of community, that sense of normality, because our lives aren't normal at the moment. But seeing a podcast drop once a week or however often you do it, that's a little bit of normality. And, when they put their headphones on or however they do it for 45 minutes, an hour, they are taken away to, dare I say, what life used to be like. So for that reason, we're definitely going to carry on, because I think we are appreciated more.
Henke?
Yeah, I have the same experience, and people writing like, for 1 hour, I didn't think about this shit, and thank you for continue doing it. So I won't stop.
Yeah.
We were already doing some, so I think for us, we've just found that artists are freer. So actually, it's easier. There's less pressure on people. So it's good for us in terms of booking. And it's a shame not to be in the room, obviously. But I imagine people will want to do the interviews in person afterwards when they can. And the advantage this will have is when we can't do it in person, for example, when we're doing an international one, they'll just be more willing, because everyone will have got more used to the whole concept of doing these things remotely and all that sort of thing. So hopefully it's an all-round positive for us when things get back to normal.
Yeah, and I have to add, I'm sorry for you guys, but in Sweden we can actually meet still. We can be up to 50 people. So I still meet face-to-face interviews.
True.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm going to jump back over to some questions, because we've got quite a few people who are obviously interested in either starting up a podcast or learning about a podcast. So I'm just going to try and get through a couple of these. So we have a question from George, who's asking, for someone who's never studied any radio or audio courses, but have internally worked for companies on webinars and conference calls, what are your suggestions to becoming a producer? What could his next steps be to kind of educate himself into maybe recording, producing? Is there any courses you did? Did you go to university, colleges, that kind of thing?
I completely learnt on the job. And I think the best thing to do is just start making a podcast. You just have to get going with it, and you learn to edit by editing something. That's probably what I would say. And I think you kind of have to make all the mistakes to not make them again, definitely in live radio. And I think that applies to podcasting as well. We've all forgotten to press record. Well, I have. I don't know if anybody else has. And then like 5 minutes into the interview, you're like, shit. So it's just by just doing it, practice, start making something.
Yeah. And have a few people around you whose opinion you trust. So you're not just relying on yourself, and it's not so scary if someone else who you trust thinks it's good as well, then there's hopefully twice the chance that it is okay.
I also learnt on the job. The one thing I would say if you're starting a podcast up is remember it's not live, which is brilliant. No one can hear your mistakes. You can edit them out. Obvious thing, you need to learn to edit. Now, there are a zillion systems out there, and I'm sure we've all got our favorite weapons of choice which we prefer to use, which we're comfortable with. I'm not going to sit here and say which I think is best, because say it's horses for courses, but you've got to learn to edit. There are a zillion courses online. There's some loads of brilliant courses on YouTube and similar platforms. Even nowadays I'll go, how do I do this effect on X, and I'll type it into YouTube and somebody somewhere has told me how to do it. With editing, it's I find it's just like, when you learn to edit, you think you can edit, but in a weird way you can't. The same way when you learn to drive, you can't actually drive that well. It's just getting miles on the clock. The more you do it, it'll become second nature. And and also when you work with the same people, I can see a waveform and I can know who that is. I know who's talking and I know which bits they're going to take out because I know I've worked with them so much. My other little tip when it comes to editing is listen with fresh ears. You can send yourself into a real tailspin by going over and over and over again. And sometimes it's just put it down. Just put it down, go and have a cup of tea, go for a walk when we're still allowed to walk. Even sleep on it and come back because your brain gets frazzled, especially if you're editing loads and loads and loads. You've got to get it down to, sometimes we do an hour and a half, an hour and 45, and I've got to get it down to 50 minutes. And it's just literally doing my head in. I was like, leave it, come back.
I think that is the point.
Another really good tip. Oh, sorry, Will, go on.
I was just going to say that is where the sort of going for a walk and listening to it makes such a difference. To being sat in front of your computer listening to it.
And also, I'm perhaps not a little bit lax, and I think podcasts in general are a little bit more lax than radio. I sometimes, just let it go. If, you might hear that tiny half a breath. Is anyone else going to hear it? Maybe I'm a bit lax than everyone else on this panel, but sometimes I'm a bit like, whatever, get up. we'll leave it in there. We'll leave it in there.
There's always a new episode next week, so
exactly.
Let it go. Yeah,
let it go. Although sadly, podcasts do live forever. Again, back when I started in radio, once it was out there, it was out in the ether, and nobody. If you made a mistake, no one heard it ever again. But now there's catch up and there's podcasts and all that sort of stuff. But going back to the initial point, starting a podcast, and I know we touched on passion. If you're passionate about it, if you've got that passion about it, that will come across. And it will not necessarily be easy, but your research, your writing, your booking, what you want to tell the audience will come across because that's what you want to do. Do something you believe in, do something you're passionate about, because you've got the whole world to broadcast to. And even though it might be the tiniest thing, I think Alice talked about quilt stitching, making, whatever it was. There will be a global audience who wants to listen to whatever it is.
A really specific point about editing, I don't know if that's helpful, but I find it much easier to edit when you have recorded the voices in separate tracks. You probably do the same, Mark. Then you can edit down. If people are talking over each other, you can just put them down, their level down. So it makes it, I find it so much easier to edit if you've recorded separate tracks for each voice.
Yeah.
And probably the other thing is, don't underestimate how long it'll take you. So if you're trying to start off doing a podcast, don't try and record for 2 or 3 hours because it will take you days to edit, basically.
Great advice. And I'm going to go to Henke because you did actually mention this before, because I just want to take this back to we're getting a lot of questions with people asking, obviously startup questions and recording. So you were talking a little bit about microphone technique.
Yeah.
So can you, because do you do a lot of location recording? So you actually go in and interviewing people there. So what advice could you sort of give to distance from microphones, types of microphones, that kind of thing?
Well, microphone close. Doesn't really matter what types of microphone you use as long as you have them close. I really put effort in to take down, what do you say, bleeding from microphone to microphone, because that's the worst. So as small as bleeding as possible. That's number one. And then to take away things that are sounding bad, like refrigerators. I use often to go home to people. I love that, to go to their homes and interview them. And I mean, if they want to sit in the kitchen, it's fine, but don't be shy to, I'm going to plug that refrigerator out for an hour while we're talking, and a fan or something, just shut it off. Pull down the curtains, maybe put a tablecloth on the table, or like, you are the rock star of the podcast, so just go in there and decide that we can record here, but I want to do something, because then my my job will get so much easier when I'm editing when I'm back home. So, and of course I've learned that from not doing it the first.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I think that's a really big.
Make all the mistakes.
Yeah, when I was looking at your questions as sort of ahead of time, it was one thing that really came up when it comes to mixing and editing and engineering is just getting it right in the room as much as you can. I mean, especially when you're doing a long podcast, you want it to look after itself as much as possible, because if you do have a bad time where you've got a lot of background noise or a lot of bleed and you have to start manually going in and ducking things or trying to use the gates as much as you can, it just all gets hard work. And manage to get it right in the room without too much bleed, and it's quiet, and you know, and people aren't going on and off the mic. I mean, I get obsessed about thinking about how to encourage good mic technique because these people aren't necessarily used to being on a mic in that way. How do you encourage them to sort of, what is the right distance for a pop shield that they're close enough that I want, where I want them, but there's also not popping, and I don't know. I sort of think about, I'm still very much in the process of trying to work out what is the best way to naturally, without guess even thinking about it, encourage sort of good behavior from them in the room.
And don't be shy to like remind them half an hour into the interview when they start to dropping the mic, if they have a handhold mic, like, please hold the mic. I mean, that took me a lot of guts the first time to like a huge rock star to tell them to hold the mic, especially if it was a singer. But now I do it because I hate bleeding.
Yeah, I could definitely get better coaching them. I think doing more of my spiel before I start an episode improves each time. I think in terms of pulling them up during it, I could probably be a bit bolder.
I think, Will, you'll probably know more about this as a sound engineer, but I think if you are starting off a podcast, your mates in a room and you're just like three of you sat around a table, again, it's just basics. I think Henke said it, put down a tablecloth, shiny surface, windows, horrible, draw the curtains. People have a habit of banging tables when they talk. Tiny little things, but basic things, which when you're starting off will make a big difference.
And I guess that is it's an attitude of attention to detail, isn't it? And that's something that if you're, I think anyone who does end up producing quality stuff sort of naturally has that. It's important, I think. All those little things not only make your life easier, but do come out in the wash.
And what Henke was saying about being close to the mic is somebody sent me a recording the other day. I was like, I don't understand why it sounds so bad. I've got a really good mic. And basically, they were just too far away from the mic, but the level looked fine because they'd massively turned up the gain. So then you just had this massive hiss, and they were miles away from the mic. So what you want is to be close to the mic, turn the gain down, turn the level down, so that you're getting the level that way. That so that it's because you're close enough to the mic. That's a really important one.
Then, on that point of being close to a mic, not too close to a mic, about the sort of pop shield thing, because as you get in the last sort of 5 centimeters, you suddenly start to get the massive bass tip up, and then that can totally change the EQ you might be trying to put on a mic to sort of make someone sound right. So wherever they are, you kind of want them to stay in the same place, ideally close, but not too close. All this little stuff.
I think they say like a fist and a thumb, don't they?
Fist and a thumb, yeah.
And if they don't want to hold them, they're really insistent on not holding the mic, and you have to put it down on a small stand. A pile of books is always very handy, and most people have books in their houses. Just get them, stack them up.
You go for handheld mics, do you?
No, we don't. But sometimes we do if we're going out and about. But I'd go off and do some other recordings for other stuff. And sometimes, if they don't want to hold the mic, or I don't want them to hold the mic, they want to sit down. Little tiny stand, and I just pile of books, get it. Sort of under the chin. Happy days.
Fantastic. That's great. So I guess from what I take from that is a lot of you've just done a trial and error type situation. So let me flip the question. Let me flip the question to what's the best piece of advice that someone has given you for podcasting or recording? So someone has given you a piece of advice, or you've sought a piece of advice. What's the best tip that you've been given, and in what situation was it?
Well, sorry, just because it's just come to mind straight away, so apologies for jumping in. In terms of going out to record people, whether it's for podcasts or whatever, the best piece of advice anyone ever told me was check your equipment before you leave.
Yeah.
Check that it works, check that you've got batteries, check that you've got a sound card. Back in my day, it was plumbing tape, but anyway. And, you know, check that you've got everything. Cables, spare cables. Cables get damaged really easily because, you know, people get trapped them, they get wound in the wrong way. Check, because once you're there, especially if you traveled a long way and it's not working, A, it's incredibly embarrassing, number one, and B, there's nowhere really to go. So check.
There's nothing worse than that feeling of something
worse.
Not working and
Nothing
you get
worse.
sweats and you're like, oh. I think, mine would be similar to what Henke was saying about, you know, putting a tablecloth or closing the curtains. Just try and get them to agree to let you record in their bedroom. I mean, that's the best place, or the lounge. I mean, I say that I produce a podcast where we record most of it in the kitchen, but you are going to get a better sound if you're in a soft furnished room. Another bit of advice that I got, which was kind of relates to what we were saying before about how podcasts you can be more relaxed. When I first started making podcasts for The Guardian, the head of audio there said, oh, you know, don't doesn't need to be so polished. You don't need to make it really polished. You know, our house style is a bit kind of rough around the edges. So, you know, looking back now, I don't necessarily agree. I do think you need to have high quality audio. But what I've taken from that is that you can be a bit more relaxed. You don't have to worry about the paraphernalia of radio where you have the junctions, or relating to what we were saying earlier about how, you know, you can sort of leave in the fire alarm or leave in somebody arriving. It's nice to kind of capture that. Because you have more time, there's no set rules. So yeah, just sort of enjoy the freedom that the podcast gives you.
Yeah, I think something that we heard sort of early on, I think we were sort of trying to do anyway, but was reiterated to us, was treating the listeners' time with respect. And no, I mean, you know, I mean, that is just keep them interested, obviously, but don't let it waffle on if you can help it.
That's a good advice.
Yeah. And really remember that people are listening on their headphones. It's a really intimate medium. So, you know, be gentle in people's heads in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, just picking up on Will's point. And again, this is, you know, when you produce something, there's production that goes into it, there's during and after, and they all sort of work together. But I think when you're doing that, is sometimes we can get a bit into the moment. And we can all be sat around thinking, this is great, it's fantastic, it's brilliant, we'll have a wonderful time, this is hilarious. And sometimes you can become a little bit too in. And that's why, again, take fresh ears when you edit, because you might be in that studio and think this is absolute gold, this is going to win you awards and everything, you know. And, you know, you get back and you think, well, actually, maybe I might slice this in half, actually. Because you do get caught up in the moment.
Yeah. I have to say, I find that quite annoying. The sort of how important fresh ears is. You know, you think you're doing a great job of the edit, and then you listen back later and you just think, why did I leave that in? And yeah, it's quite annoying.
Well, in a horrendous name drop, so apologies. I once, for a documentary, interviewed Noel Gallagher, and he was talking about one of their albums, I think it was Be Here Now, and he said they would go to bed and they'd go, this is better than the Beatles. This is better than the Beatles and the Stones. This is better than the Beatles and the Stones. And they'd come back and listen to it about 2-3 days and go, this is a pile of, and they go, yeah, isn't it? And I think, you know, I would never compare myself to Noel Gallagher in any way, shape or form, thank you very much, because he's a supremely talented musician and I'm not. But the principle remains, you know, you can get caught in the moment, you think this is brilliant and fantastic and wonderful, no one's going to love it, it's hilarious, but actually just be an editor. That's what you're doing. You're there to edit, to make it better.
Yeah. Leave enough time to do the editing with that regard.
Yeah.
You have time to step away. I think we have, it's a lot of work to get it out. And we can't just do it full time. We have other part-time jobs. So sometimes I do just have to do it up to the wire, and you think, well, I want one more listen through, and you don't get it. So the further ahead, the easier you'll make your life.
Oh, actually, that's a very good thing though. Listen from start. I always listen from start to finish. Again, that might be an old radio thing. But I know people who have sometimes say, oh, I've done that, stick it out. And they've left something in there. Always listen from start to finish before you let the world listen. Even if you listen to it 50 times.
Yeah, because you might have like accidentally moved a bed and it comes out in the wrong place. Or what I often do is I'll do my edit, do it again, and then I'll send it to myself and listen like on my way to work or on the tube or on, you know, a couple of days later, and then even jot down in my phone in my notes 1836, cut that bit out, and just do it over, you know, a few days.
Question actually for you guys in terms of what order, in terms of sort of doing big sweep, detailed, big sweep, you know, you sort of go between the two, I find, but I haven't necessarily settled on whether I think, right, I should just do one big general sweep trying to cut out big bits, or I go straight in for detailed, because then I'm left with a sort of quality thing to then try and get the sort of bigger story picture on. Do you have a routine you go through in terms of, right, I'll do one listen through where I don't stop much and I just try and cut out big chunks, and then I'll go detailed, and then I'll go back to a big sweep, that sort of thing? What's your have you arrived at?
I have to take that one. I kind of think every week when I start editing a new episode, today I'm going to listen to the whole thing before I start do anything. But I've never succeeded in that, because I hear something and I take it away, and then I hear somebody's coughing or something, I cut that away, or I do some EQ things, and then so I do all the things from the beginning to the end, then I start all over. And sometimes it takes 3 times and sometimes 8 times.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, I do the same. It's too difficult to listen to it and hear all the bad things without just getting straight in there and getting them out straight away.
Even if you do end up sort of making some bits beautiful that don't end up in there, but there's not another way.
Yeah, that's the risk. What I have done actually in the past is I've just sent myself, instead of sending myself the first cut, I'll just send myself the raw edit. If I'm really busy and I know that I'm going to be on the tube quite a bit, or, you know, running around, I'll send myself the raw audio. And I've done this once, and I've thought, I should probably do this more often, where I'll send myself the raw audio and just jot down in my notes on my phone, right, from 18 to 25, cut that out. Like, and that was actually quite good actually, to do that again. Forgot about that.
The sort of thing I'm talking about, but again, very much like you, Henke, once you start listening, you can't help yourself.
No.
Yeah, even if it's EQ exactly and stuff like that.
Yeah. That's just a small one about the greatest advice you got. I get from a sound engineer. He said that a human person can't hear anything under 100 hertz. So take that away immediately, because that, like, those pops that you will have, and when people bang in the table and stuff, they're so much nicer to your ears if you take from 100 hertz and down away. Maybe everybody's doing that of you guys, but maybe everybody who's listening doesn't know it. So take that away, because it doesn't imply on the sound quality, but it's much more nice to your ears.
Yeah.
You guys agree?
Yeah, do the same. It's about trying to find that sort of point where you're keeping as much of the sort of depth of their voice in there, but getting rid of as much of as possible of the sort of unnecessary stuff. But try not to get the pops in the first place
of course not.
Is the real key, because they
will be there once in a while.
Another really good trick is, which I was told, is to always record a bit of wild track. So just with nobody speaking, just get the sound of the room. That can really help in an edit as well.
Yeah, and I'm a big one for wild track, and I probably do far too much. And, you know, I've been known to go and stand next to the clock, because I know that clock might come out on the edit, because I'm boring like that. And, you know, I record a clock just on the off chance that you could hear in that edit, and obviously it's going to clockwork, so you would hear the edit, so I can mask it. But definitely wild track. So big. Yeah. It can mask 1,000 edits, literally.
It's really funny, actually. In the classical industry, that's common practice. You always record ambience, and you often have to do it several times because the traffic's different, or there's all sorts of different things happening. I don't actually specifically do it for the podcast, although I will have to go and find some that I need sometimes. It's something I should start doing, because you do need it.
Yeah. It's weird if you suddenly, like, somebody's speaking and there's a siren in the background, and then suddenly the siren stops, or like the airplane is hasn't quite made it out of the sky far enough away. It's like,
I'm a massive denoising geek from my sort of classical background. We have some very good software for that, so occasionally I can go and get very nerdy with that and take I need to make an edit work sort of thing.
It's a great tip. Someone's just pinged in there saying, what is wild track?
So it's just recording the space without anybody talking. So it's like the ambience. So if there's if somebody's telling a story and you need to cut some of it out, but at that time there was the sound of a car or a helicopter or a siren. If you get that somewhere else, and you can then mask your edit. So it's just recording the space.
Yeah, especially if you're in a vaguely not you're obviously trying to avoid a noisy area, but if you are outside, I do stuff at sports stadium where there's either a hum or a crowd, and if you're if you're interviewing someone, if you can imagine you've got a track, you're gonna have the track of the interviewee, and then you have the track. If you get the wild track, you can put that on separately on your mixer, and then when you cut, you can just smooth it over. So it's just it's just a noise around you, really, the ambient noise that if we're not talking. So it's just get 30 seconds of it, 40 seconds, a minute, I don't know, and you've got it. And you can use it to mask those clunky edits, basically.
Fantastic tips. We are out of time. I can't believe that's been 90 minutes. We've really enjoyed that. Thank you all for answering and participating. This has been the Sennheiser Sound Academy as part of the Don't Stop the Education. And again, I just want to thank you all for all your input and everything. These will be made available afterwards, so if anyone's missed it or enjoyed it and you want to refer it to a friend, please do so. But yeah, I'd like to thank you all and wish you all well for the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go well.
Real nice
Cheers.
meeting you guys. Good luck with
Oh, well.
everything.
Yeah, good luck. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Cheers.
See you guys. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.